Irish depth chart for the Rugby World Cup 2023, folks. This is the last depth chart we're going to do. The Irish named their squad relatively late in the piece. We're going to go through depth by position, who are the kind of main omissions, and what is the top 15 over this entire Rugby World Cup cycle. If you haven't seen any other depth charts, basically what we're doing is looking at this entire World Cup cycle, seeing which players have been played in which positions, who's getting the majority of the game time. Are there positions where a team is totally reliant on one player? Are there positions where it's been chopping and changing so much that there is no kind of clear front runner? Well, spoiler alert, Ireland are a very, very stable squad. Andy Farrell has worked things, I would say, if you're looking at starting from, the start of the World Cup cycle with the target on the World Cup, pretty masterfully. There's not really any major guys who were part of his squad that have just totally fallen out of favour, fallen off a cliff. There's a few guys who are maybe close. A lot of guys who've had a try, but then maybe not really stuck. But yeah, compared to a lot of the other squads, very, very stable. If you want to check out ones that are pretty messy, Wales, Australia, England, with the ones with the coaching changes, not great. New Zealand, relatively stable. South Africa, pretty stable. France, pretty stable. But I think Ireland in this kind of takes the cake. If we look at the entire squad, every colour up there being a player and how much game time they had in their position. There are a few standout guys who do dominate in their position. You are looking at the likes of James Ryan as your tight head lock. Number 5 there, he's got like 70% of the game time. And he's also played a little bit of game time on the other side of the second row as well. Number 7, Josh van der Fleer. Very, very similar game time on the open side flank. He did kind of lose that position ever so briefly during this World Cup cycle, but has retained it pretty well. We're also looking at number 15, Hugo Keenan. Maybe not in 2020, but pretty much since then, 21, 22, and 23, fullback has been very much the Hugo Keenan show. So 3 guys totally dominant in their position. If we are looking for positions which are maybe like a little bit more of a, I would say kind of a healthy mix between your first choice guy, your backup guy, and then the third. We're looking at like number 8 as kind of a nice split between 3 players, a decent sized chunk, around about half for the first guy, and then still sizable enough chunks for the 2 backups that it's a respectable amount of game time. Number 12 in the midfield also looks pretty nice. And then if you're looking at the front row, which is, guys who traditionally don't play quite as much, very rarely go 80 minutes, it also looks like pretty nice chunks in all 3 positions, for getting some decent game time. But what we really need to do is compare this to who are the guys not going to the World Cup and how much of an absence is going to be felt with those guys missing. If we start with the front row, it's Cian Healy's absence that makes this look not as stable as it could. You look at 2 and 3, those little slivers of grey up the top, those are the minutes that are not going to the World Cup. This is what I mean about Andy Farrell got his plan and just rode with it. There's virtually no game time. Remember, there's a Lions tour for the Irish guys to plan around as well. Though from memory, they only played a couple of games during the Lions. They played Japan and like USA, but so maybe not quite as disruptive as some other teams who played more games in that time. But still, there's bugger all game time in those 2 positions which aren't going to the World Cup. Number 2, Herring is in green, Sheehan is in blue, Kelleher is in yellow. They're all much of a muchness in terms of the game time. Herring's had the most, but more at the kind of start of the Rugby World Cup cycle. He's probably been surpassed a little bit by the other 2 guys, although the other 2 guys have had a little bit of time off injured recently. Tight head, Furlong, Porter, Beelum, O'Toole. Just a little sliver of John Ryan up there at the top. And I think that was in one of those games like against Japan or the USA. Other side, as I said, Cian Healy is by far the biggest chunk of that loose head prop side, around about a third of the game time. So he's been very much a present force for the Irish on that loose head side, and his injury is probably the worst one of all the positions we're going to go across in terms of what you're missing with that injury. It's obviously brutal for him as a player at a stage in his career and whatnot, but also just in terms of this World Cup cycle, that's That's rough. I mean, Andrew Porter's there in green since he's taken over the loosehead duties. Dave Cocoy, Jeremy Loughman, and then even Finlay Beelum, I think, started one game at loosehead, maybe came on as a substitute in another for loosehead as well. But if Cian Healy's numbers were in this graph, it'd pretty much be virtually no grey at all, like just those little slivers at the top. So, yeah, she's been pretty stable in the front row. The Cian Healy injury one is the worst looking bit. Second row, it's very similar. There's such little game time, which is not going to the World Cup. You're looking at Tyke Byrne, number 4, and then James Ryan, number 5. Big chunks of green. And then both of the blues and both the locks, Ian Henderson. Ian Henderson tends to swap which side he plays on. I think sometimes they keep the numbers the same. I was just looking at which position they would pack him down to the scrum. It tends to be that if James Ryan's alongside Hendo, then James Ryan goes on the tight head side, but not exclusively. And Tyke Byrne usually goes on the loose head side of the second row, but yeah, they can all kind of cover both if needs be. You've also got a bit of Ryan Baird in there. He's covered both sides of the locking positions, but there's a lot of guys who are not going who have locked the scrum for Ireland, like Quinn Rule, Alton Delan, Devon Toner, Kieran Treadwell, Joe McCarthy. Some of them are a long time ago, some of them are a lot more recent, but the main guys who have been ever present for Ireland are going to the World Cup. So it's a position you would say, man, there's heaps of depth. Heaps of depth in that squad. The back row is maybe a little bit of a chunk missing at number 8. And that main chunk is CJ Stander, who decided to retire. So that's another one where you feel like if he'd been fit and available and the way Andy Farrell plans things, he probably would have remained in the squad. Maybe somebody else doesn't get a chance. There's been a few guys getting a chance in this Irish squad in recent times. You know, the likes of Cian Prendergast is a recent example, but you're still pretty well stocked in the loose forward. So number 6, Peter Romani gets around about half the game time. Caelan Doris also played some 60s there in blue. Tyke Byrne, Jack Conan, Ryan Baird, they've all had a crack at number 6, but Romani's by far and away your leading candidate. Number 7, Josh van der Fleer, like I mentioned, so dominant number 7. If anything, you'd say there's not really a second candidate who's specialised at 7 that's been getting regular game time. Peter Romani's played there in blue. Caelan Doris very recently played there in yellow. And then number 8, Caelan Doris, just under half the game time at number 8. So if you take Doris's numbers across all 3 positions, he's been ever present. And then Jack Conan in blue. So you are missing a lot of game time with CJ Stander, around about a quarter. But we're talking 2020, 2021, so way earlier in the World Cup cycle. Other guys who've missed out, as I mentioned, Cian Prendergast, Gavin Coombs also missed out. Max Deegan's had a bit of game time. Will Connors for a while looked like he'd surpassed Van der Fleer before Van der Fleer kind of came raging back. Didn't Connors? He's had a bit of injury, hasn't he? Nick Timoney's also had a bit of game time at 7, but it's not a heck of a lot. Yeah. I guess if Josh Van der Fleer was to get injured, that would be, in terms of specialists, that would be one of your kind of more concerning positions. But remember, you can always bring somebody in. Backs, 9 and 10. Sexton at 10 doesn't have a replacement guy who genuinely gets like a third or more of the game time. Like Sexton's there with over half of the game time at 10. He's the captain. It makes sense. He's missed a few games recently with suspension. They've kind of managed his minutes, you know, just because the dude's getting older. You need to be mindful of how much game time he plays. The backups are Ross Byrne with that blue chunk and then Jack Crowley with that yellow chunk. So both those guys, you're still looking at kind of less than a fifth of the game time. So I feel like ideally your backup 10 has a bit more game time in that. There's an ambulance siren in the background. Hopefully not taking any more injured players to the injury ward because there's been a lot of players going down recently. But yeah, Sexton's going to be the guy at the World Cup, assuming he's fit, and he's going to play 10. He's the captain. So as long as he's fit, that question doesn't really require much answering. 9 is a split between Gibson Park there in green and Conor Murray there in blue. Craig Casey with that yellow chunk has had a decent enough amount of game time. And they've certainly used some other 9s who've not made it, like Marmion and Cooney and Blade. And 10s as well. Joey Carberry is probably the biggest omission. Billy Burns had a crack in 2021. Harry Burns had a while. I think Jack Carty might have got 1 minute in this Rugby World Cup cycle. But I think there's a little bit more depth at 9 than there is at 10, although Jack Crowley's emergence in recent times, maybe he's been kind of too... How old is Jack Crowley? Is he too young to have kind of featured at the start of this World Cup cycle? But in recent times, he's certainly been looking the business. Midfield, it's just a familiar theme, man. It's very stable. 12, Bundyaki, around about half the game time. McCloskey, Henshaw, that's really nice. I mentioned that when we looked at the overall numbers. That's a really good mix. If Aki, McCloskey, or Henshaw start a Rugby World Cup knockout game, I feel like you're pretty comfortable. They obviously bring different things to the game, but each of them is a kind of proven campaigner. 13 is Ringrose with half the game time, and then Henshaw. So again, if you combine Henshaw's numbers, he's also a genuinely high number contributor, but his versatility means his numbers are split across different positions. Some of your kind of more bit part players at 12 and 13. Keith Earls has played a bit of 13. Jimmy O'Brien has. And then some of the guys like Ringrose and McCloskey and even Sexton and whatnot have popped in when needs be. Sometimes when there's guys go off right at the end or injuries or yellow cards or whatever, the back line can shuffle around a little bit. But your specialist guys are pretty much all there. I mean, Chris Farrell and James Hume are the main guys who you're missing out in the midfield who have featured in this World Cup cycle, but the main contributors are all there. And then back three, left wing, James Lowe, more than half the game time. Mac Hansen's featured on the left, Keith Earls, Hugo Keenan a bit, Jimmy O'Brien. So if anything, James Lowe is your kind of specialist left winger. All the other guys have essentially been kind of bit part players. And their right wing, a bit more of a split between Hansen and Earls, and then a bit of Hugo Keenan, and even Gary Ringrose has popped there at the end of games as well. That's actually interesting in the right wing with Mac Hansen. That's the least game time of any one player in any one position with around about a third. Now that's a dream compared to what we've seen by some of the other teams. Some of the other teams, 30% or 33% or whatever of the game time is massive, because they've got guys who have had 50, 60% of the game time aren't going to the World Cup. So I think you'd be pretty happy with that. Fullback, Hugo Keenan, totally dominant at fullback. He's another guy kind of like Josh van der Fleer, who's such a specialist in his position that you would hate to see him get injured. His fitness, you feel like, is going to be crucial to Ireland's campaign. Obviously, Jimmy O'Brien's there in blue. He's had a bit of game time, but he's no Hugo Keenan. Hugo Keenan's on the kind of world-class level at the minute. And then Jack Crowley's filled in at fullback if needs be as well, but I don't think he started there for Ireland. So, yeah, the guys who have missed out, Andrew Conway, I think he's injured at the moment anyway, but he's not featured for a wee while. There's been a few guys who've tried a bit of game time on the right wing. Balakoon's been there. Jordan Lama's been there. I mean, Jordan Lama's had a bit of time at fullback as well. Jacob Stockdale is probably the most of game time that's not going to the World Cup across. Remember, he had a while where he was starting fullback. He had a while where he was the starting winger. Other guys like Kelvin Nash and Shane Daly and Addison and Mike Lowry and whatnot have all had a bit of game time in various positions. But once again, and it is true with every position, the vast majority of the game time is heading to the World Cup, which, I don't know, man, it just makes for good planning, good cohesion. The fact that my All Blacks are bringing in what we call them bolters to come in can be a good thing, because if there's a guy who has a cracking season for his club and is just looking like the best player in his position, sure, you got to pick him. But there's something kind of reassuring about this all seemingly kind of have gone to plan. Now, the major omissions where things haven't maybe gone to plan, that's the Kean Healy injury. Obviously, you can't account for that. Andrew Conway is one that was probably surpassed by Mac Hansen anyway, but I don't think he was available for selection at the end of the campaign, was he anyway? Stockdale's one who's kind of his stocks, that's not an unintended pun, have kind of fallen, and there's CJ Stunder's retirement. Those are your biggest guys in terms of minutes that have left the kind of Irish rugby system. And you've only used 68 players. When you're looking at some of the other teams, like England 80 plus, was it the Aussies that were 90 plus? The Welsh were 90 plus. Well, maybe the Aussies were 70, but a lot more players have been used. The Irish squad, in the scheme of things, is kind of relatively small in terms of the guys who've had game time. You're starting 15 based on the guys who've had the most game time in their position for Ireland in this World Cup cycle. It's Porter, Herring, and Furlong as your front row. Although I think realistically it's Sheehan or Kelleher if they are fit. But Herring's had more game time than those two guys, especially at the start of the cycle. Byrne and Ryan in the second row, with Henderson as your kind of third choice guy in either position, or second choice in either position. Back row of Omani, Van der Fleer, and Doris. And there's no real surprise there, man. That's pretty much, if you asked anybody, barring Hooker, I think you would probably write down the majority of those names just off the top of your head. 9-10, Gibson Park and Sexton. Midfield, Aki and Ringrose. But remembering that's kind of individual positions. If you added Henshaw, both 12 and 13 together, he'd be your guy. And then Lowe, Hansen, and Keenan. That's more or less just the Irish starting 15, isn't it? More or less. There's a few guys I said you can tinker with, but yeah. They're not missing an Intermac like Francois or a Pollard or a Lacanio that kind of thing. Fortunately, at the moment, things are very stable. Every single guy who I've read out who's had the most minutes in his position across this World Cup cycle is in the team. There's no super experienced guy who's been ever present in this World Cup cycle who's been dropped at the last minute kind of thing. It's all very stable. So, yeah. For what it's worth, I think it looks pretty good. As I said, there are a couple of guys, the likes of Van der Fleer, the likes of a Keenan at the back. I mean, your props as well, there's probably a bit of a downgrade between Porter Furlong and the next guys, although I do like the fact that Finlay Beelam's come a long way in kind of recent times as well. And obviously Sexton doesn't have a kind of bang-on, ironclad replacement. Ross Byrne is still, I would say, unproven. If you were in a World Cup quarterfinal, it's a heck of a lot of pressure to put on that guy. And Jack Crowley's got heaps of potential, but it's a different story when you've been put into that kind of pressure cooker situation. But yeah, that is the Irish depth chart. That's the last of the depth charts. If you're looking to look at some more depth charts to compare this to how the other squads are bloody all over the shop, check them out. I'll check the playlist in the description. They're a pain in the backside to make, but I find them fascinating. So I hope you guys have appreciated them. If anyone wants to buy me a beer or a coffee, it's down in the description. I'm going to need some coffees over the World Cup with the time difference here in New Zealand. But yes, that's the Irish depth chart, folks. That's the last one. I was going to do Italy and Japan, but sadly I think time is kind of running out for those, and there's heaps of rugby content to be made. So yeah, I will probably be giving those ones a miss. But yes, Ireland depth chart. You guys let us know what your thoughts are. How do you think this very stable Irish squad is going to go at the World Cup? Cheers for staying all the way to the end. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.